Hey, deserving listeners. Today's episode is a deep dive on the concept of trauma dumping. I have a serious problem with the way this term is being used online, and I'm going to get into it in this episode. I think that there are some legitimate usages of this term, and I'm going to delineate between the legitimate usages that I will absolutely stand behind, and I'm going to draw a line between that and the vast majority of the usages that are not only just wrong-headed, but also harmful and stigmatizing. So let's get into it. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I am your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. And I want to start with an example. So the reason why I finally decided to do a systematic look at the research and the literature and my own thoughts and what's being talked about online about trauma dumping is because on Love is Blind Season 8, if you are watching that with me on YouTube, you will know that this topic came up in this season quite heavily with one of the characters, one of the cast members. Her name is Madison. So I'm going to present to you now an audio of the show, an excerpt of the audio in which people were attributing the term trauma dumping to. So what you're going to be listening to right now is a conversation between Madison and Alex. They are in the pods. They can't see each other because it's Love is Blind, and they are on a date, and they're getting to know each other. So let's hear that conversation.
You're saying all the right things, Madison.
I had a rough childhood.
I want to hear about that.
My parents never got married, actually, so they had me when they were 19.
Wow. Really?
My mom, she was really surrounded by a lot of drugs, and she was in kind of a rehab program when she met my dad, and they had me in an accident.
Okay, so just chiming in here, that's the beginning of what people were calling trauma dumping. We hear that they're getting to know each other, they're talking more explicitly about emotions, it's getting a little deeper, and she says, yeah, I kind of had a rough childhood, and then you hear Alex say, well, let's listen to that specifically again.
I had a rough childhood.
I want to hear about that.
Yeah, so my parents never got married, actually, so they had me when they were 19.
All right, so I want to highlight that because that will come up later. That little snippet is an important snippet in terms of evaluating whether or not it was trauma dumping or not. So let's listen to a little bit more, because I think that for some people, the depth at which she goes into in this disclosure is part of why people are saying it's trauma dumping. So let's listen to more of it.
I also actually lost my stepdad when I was in 8th grade to a drug overdose.
Oh, no. Madison.
My relationship with my mother is tough. I still talk to her when I can. Sometimes it gets to be a bit much for me because I've just had to be like a parent to her my whole life. But I really love her. I have a lot of compassion for her.
All right, just chiming in here. So if you have not watched Love is Blind Season 8 and you listen to this podcast, you are in all likelihood hearing some markers of trauma and of issues that we get into in this podcast, maybe even a history that might resonate with you a little bit. So if you're interested in me responding specifically to what she's talking about, you can watch my reaction videos on YouTube. But getting back to the task at hand regarding evaluating trauma dumping, one thing to keep in mind is that the show is edited fairly heavily. I don't know what they are editing out, whether it is just ums or silences. But one of the things I wonder about is if the listeners or the watchers of the show were claiming that it was trauma dumping because of how seemingly quickly it gets into the more, I don't know what you call it, the more intense details of her history. If you just watch the show or even just listen to what I presented, it might seem like she got into the intensity fairly quickly. And it's possible that she did, but it's also possible that there were other transitions. There seemed to be some pretty abrupt edits that I see in that sequence. The show is trying to present a story, and they're not going to present the exact conversation as it took place because there's a lot of tangents and meanderings and ums and silences that they are editing out. And sometimes the editors are trying to deceive, obviously. So we can't know. But we can know what the audience was watching, which is this sequence. Now, I wouldn't call this a rapid descent into intensity because I'm just used to this, not only as a therapist, but as a citizen. There's no threat in terms of what she's talking about. And I wouldn't even necessarily say it's particularly intense. She's not emoting in the moment, which would be okay if she were to do. She's laying out, the broad strokes, really, the intense, gory details, if you will, I'm sure are vast and complicated and filled with emotion and difficulty. And still, if I were on a date and someone were to talk about that, it would not threaten me. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, but let's listen to a little bit more.
She didn't break all the generational curses, but she probably broke some. So now I would say I'm close with my brother and my sister. Like, I just want to be the person for them that I never had.
Yeah, first of all, I'm very sorry to hear about all of that. That's a lot, and I'm sure it has changed you a lot.
Okay, so just chiming in here, you hear her sort of wrapping up her discussion or her disclosure about her history and her family. And there was a pause there, presumably because she was giving him space to respond or wondering how he might respond. And they don't have nonverbal cues, eye contact, that kind of stuff to gauge whether or not they should pause or not. But she paused, and then Alex stepped in and said something compassionate. There's a tone of his voice. There's a willingness to listen that I'm hearing in his voice and in the things that he's saying. So that's another part of the evaluation of when I get into the definition and the criteria of trauma dumping, keep all of this in mind. Let's listen to a little bit more.
Yeah.
Turned you into the person that you are.
For sure.
I've also had some family issues, not anywhere near yours.
I want to hear about it.
Well, I had a rough time in school. I was relentlessly bullied.
All right, so take note of that exchange right there where she says, I want to hear about it. Keep that in mind when we evaluate whether or not trauma dumping is happening, because although Madison was the main target of the accusations of trauma dumping, Alex was also targeted in this way. People were saying that they were both trauma dumping. So let's keep that in mind as well as we move forward into the analysis phase, but let's listen to a little bit more.
I was beat up in the hallway. I remember going into lunch, and I'd try to sit down at a table, and people would push my tray off the table.
What the fuck?
And so I'd go eat alone in the bathroom or in the practice room and play piano or something.
Yeah.
So that was brutal for sure.
That makes my heart hurt for you.
Okay, so I think that gives you a good example of what people were reacting to when they were saying that Madison and to a lesser extent Alex were trauma dumping. There's more to the conversation, and there were other conversations kind of along these lines, but most of what people were calling trauma dumping was this conversation. And as a way of demonstrating what conversation I am reacting to, I thought I would read some posts and comments on Reddit. So the first thing I want to say about the Reddit comments is that I am not reading these comments to humiliate the person on Reddit. I am only using it as but one example of the way people online are misusing this term. It is being misused on every platform in various different contexts, whether it's Love is Blind or the millions of other contexts that people are using this. So I'm not singling this person out as a bad person. I am singling it out as, like I said, but one example of millions. I'm also not going to read the person's username, although those are anonymized. I just feel like I don't want to harm anybody. And given the misinformation about trauma dumping and trauma talk in general, I don't blame any individual. I blame the stigma and the overall misinformation that is happening online. So I just want to be clear about that. So this first person that I came across, they say, Madison and her trauma dumping. I am on episode 1, and Madison seems nice and all, but she has taken every opportunity to trauma dump to every person she's talking to. We definitely know now that she's been through a lot, but she's treating every date like a therapy session. Okay, just chiming in. So what this person is likely referring to is there was another scene in which Madison was talking to Mason, a different guy in the pods, and there was a very brief and much lighter conversation because the way that Mason was responding to not only the history that she was disclosing, but also just emotions in general, that I'm guessing that Madison didn't feel prompted to get into it. Whereas with Alex, he seemed very interested in not only just emotions, but also specifically her history, and he also reciprocated. Whereas with Mason, he didn't reciprocate in that way, either because he didn't want to get into it, or it wasn't in the edit, or he doesn't have a trauma history, or doesn't know, or something. So that's why this person is saying that she has, quote unquote, taken every opportunity to trauma dump to every person she's talking to. So I looked and obviously watched the show very closely, and I could only identify 2 different people that she talked with her history about, and that was mainly with Alex and a little bit with Mason. I don't remember her talking with anyone else about this. And if she had, maybe it was briefly with another person. So this claim that she's taken every opportunity to trauma dump to every person she's talking to, I think is a little bit of an exaggeration. And then going on, we definitely know now that she's been through a lot, but she's treating every date like a therapy session. So just chiming in here, keep that in mind, because that's another part of my analysis of this term, trauma dumping. Going on, she has interrupted her dates so she can go on long trauma dump sessions about her life or talk about herself in general. Didn't even let the men talk and put them in a position where they had to comfort her during the date rather than actually getting to know each other. So you can really hear the accusation there, right? It's not just that it's quote unquote trauma dumping. It's being narcissistic in a sense, self-centered, routing every conversation into her own trauma history, talking with everyone that she is talking to. And again, I'm not singling this person out. This person, I'm going to get to other people who are saying the exact same thing on Reddit. And this is just Reddit, right? We can go into YouTube. There are YouTube commentators of Love is Blind that are saying and have said the same thing, not only about Madison and Alex, but about other people. We could expand this to TikTok as well with Love is Blind. We could expand it beyond Love is Blind to, like I said, the millions of other contexts. So this individual is not unusual, and there's a reason for that I will get into in this deep dive. Another angle of this, if you did watch the show, that you might be thinking is that a lot of people thought that Madison was being two-faced or a pick-me girl, so to speak, in that the opinion was that, and I don't agree with this, by the way, that with some men like Alex, she was being very emotional and talking about her trauma and really getting deep into emotions and vulnerability. Whereas with Mason, she was mainly getting into sexuality talk and about appealing to him in a sexual manner, and that she was adopting different personas to trick the men into picking her or something like that. I don't know exactly what the overall consensus was, but that was not my observation. One, we're watching an edited show that is just trying to pick from hours and hours and hours of footage, the little bits that will be interesting to watch, right? And so when Madison and Mason start talking about cream pies, for example, the sexuality talk, then they're going to highlight that because it might have been literally the only interesting thing that happened in the span of 30 hours of footage of dating between the two of them. And the editors might be trying to manipulate the audience into thinking that. But the fact that you have someone, at least in the edit, that it might look a little different, given the dates with different people, shouldn't be bewildering. We should, of course, expect that, right? That when you date different people, you come together in different ways. There's different vibes. With one person, you might get into more vulnerability talk. With another person, there might be more horny talk or something, but it doesn't mean that the person is tricking or fabricating or putting on a persona. It just means that the bits that we saw just happen to represent a different vibe between these different couples. But anyway, so I say all that because when people were looking at Madison in general, they were seeing that she was being manipulative and wasn't really bringing up trauma in a legitimate, authentic way. And therefore, she's trauma dumping as a manipulation, which I'll get into. When I talk about the definition of trauma dumping, which has its legitimate usages, this is a potential angle that would legitimize the use of trauma dumping, not in this situation, but in others. All right, let's take a break. And when we get back, let's review another comment regarding trauma dumping on Reddit. All right, we're back from the break. So this other post by a different user on Reddit, on the Love is Blind subreddit, they say, the immediate trauma dumping is such a massive red flag. So they're talking about Madison. The immediate trauma dumping is such a massive red flag. It seems like every single person does it. Meaning, me chiming in here, I think what they're saying is, it seems like every single person on Love is Blind is trauma dumping all the time. Is it just for entertainment, like the producers do it? There are other, just chiming in, I think what they're saying is the producers are forcing or suggesting that the cast members trauma dump. Going on. There are other ways to get deep with someone without talking about your drug-addicted and dead family members immediately. Does this annoy anyone else, or am I a Scrooge? LOL. So just chiming in, I just want to read that second or third to last sentence. There are other ways to get deep with someone without talking about your drug-addicted and dead family members immediately. End of quote. I mean, just let that sink in. And think about what the clips I play for you. That's what they're reacting to. And then the top comment with the most upvotes is the following. This person says, trauma dumping is a good way to make a connection and also reveals who you are as a person. If you're the one playing it cool and the other guy is talking about real shit, they are likely going to pick the other guy. Okay, just chiming in. So what they're referring to, because I've read more of the comment here, is the suggestion or allegation or the analysis here is that when you go into the pods and if you're vying for someone's love in the pods and you don't trauma dump, then the person you're trying to appeal to will pick someone else because that other person is trauma dumping, right? So they're referring to just any vulnerability, any emotional talk as trauma dumping, by the way. So just keep that in mind. All right. So I hope that demonstrates to you a typical conversation online and in our society regarding trauma dumping. I presented to you the data that people were evaluating the show, Love is Blind. There's more to it than that, but that's the bulk of what people were reacting to. And I also presented to you the conversations that were happening. And I didn't have to dig deep into the internet. These were literally the first two things that came up when I searched for trauma dumping, Reddit, Love is Blind. So understand that this is the dominant conversation that's happening. Now, this is Reddit, right? There's a particular sort of people that are, being represented on those subreddits, the people who go to that subreddit, the people who will comment or upvote things. But those were, in my experience, the kinds of things that are said in a lot of different contexts. And I'm going to be referencing back to this as I go into my definition and my analysis of this term, this concept of trauma dumping. I've got a lot of opinions. It gets me hot under the collar. The rest of this episode will be for patrons of the podcasts. So if you want to hear this full deep dive, which I'm guessing is going to be at least a couple hours, you have to be a patron on Patreon. So if you're not a patron yet, go to patreon.com, go to Psychology in Seattle, or click the link below and become a patron and get access to this episode along with hundreds of other patron-exclusive episodes. There's a possibility that there's literally 1,000, hundreds of patron-exclusive episodes, and arguably our best stuff is for the patrons, because I want to reward them for literally paying my bills is what's happening, to be blunt about that. No joke about that. I wouldn't be able to do this if it weren't for the patrons. So I want to, reward them for that. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.